Chapter 4 of Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lawrence Trask, Mount Vernon, Ohio. InterfaceAudio.com. Brown Book of the Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 4, Part 2. Goebbels' plan is carried out. Dr. Oberfahren shows in his memorandum that Goebbels thought it necessary to heighten the effect of the material alleged to have been discovered in Karl Liebknecht's house by an incident of some kind. He thought that he would achieve the greatest success, we continue to give Dr. Oberfahren's account, by a series of acts of arson which were to culminate in a fire in the German Reichstag on February 27th. It was agreed that the most important Nazi leaders, Hitler, Goering, and Goebbels, were not to make any engagements to speak at election meetings on that date, but were to be in Berlin. We give below an announcement published in the Völkischer Beobachter of the election speeches which would have been made by Hitler. It is especially noticeable that Hitler kept free from the dates from the 25th to the 27th of February. February 23rd, Frankfurt am Main. February 24th, Munich. February 28th, Leipzig. March 1st, Breslau. March 2nd, Berlin. March 3rd, Hamburg. March 4th, Königsberg. The Völkischer Beobachter adds, it is possible that election meetings will also be arranged for February 25th and 26th. The time of the meetings will be between 8 and 9 p.m. So, in order to be prepared for emergencies, Hitler had kept free the dates from February 25th to 27th. But in any event, it was announced beforehand that Hitler could in no circumstances speak in any election meetings on February 27th. Contradictions in the official reports. The first official report stated that a police officer noticed people carrying lighted torches in the dark building, and that he succeeded in capturing the criminal. It further stated that the criminal was found in one of the cellars and allowed himself to be arrested without showing any resistance. On March 4th, however, a further statement describes the arrest of van der Lubbe as follows. Police on the Brandenburg Tor side of the Reichstag noticed the fire in the building. One of the police saw torches quite clearly and immediately fired. At first there was some doubt about this incident. Since then, however, the marks of the bullets have actually been found. The police then rushed into the Reichstag. They found in the lobby, not as was originally reported, in the cellars, the man Marinus van der Lubbe, who was there overpowered by one of the officers after considerable resistance. This is the first contradiction in the official reports. Charges against Torgler and Koenen. On the evening of March 1st, the official Pressedienst issued the following statement. The official investigation of the grave act of incendiarism in the building of the German Reichstag has up to the present shown that at least 7 persons must have been required for the bringing in of the inflammable material alone, while the placing of it and simultaneous setting fire to the various points in the huge building must have required at least 10 persons. No doubt whatever that the incendiaries were so completely familiar with all the details of the vast building that only unrestricted access over a number of years could have given this definite knowledge of all the rooms. Grave suspicion therefore rests on the Communist Party deputies, who particularly in recent weeks have been noticeably often meeting in the Reichstag building under the most diverse pretexts. This familiarity with the Reichstag building and with the duty arrangements of the officials also explains the fact that for the time being only the Dutch communist who was caught in the act was arrested, as after he had carried out his criminal deed he was unable to escape owing to his ignorance of the building. The arrested man, who is also known in Holland as extremely radical, has been continuously present at the meetings of the Communist Action Committee and was drawn in to carry out the act of incendiarism. The investigation has further established that 3 witnesses, some hours before the outbreak of the fire, saw the arrested Dutch criminal in the company of the Communist deputies Torgler and Koenen in the corridors of the Reichstag at about 8 o'clock in the evening. A mistake on the part of these witnesses is out of the question in view of the criminal's appearance, as moreover the deputies' entrance to the Reichstag is closed at 8 p.m., and the Communist deputies Torgler and Koenen at about 8:30 p.m. asked for their coats and hats to be brought to their rooms, and only left the building through another door at about 10 p.m. Extremely grave suspicion rests on these 2 communists, for it was between these times that the fire was arranged. The rumor that Deputy Torgler voluntarily presented himself at police headquarters is not correct. It is true that through his legal advisor he asked for a safe conduct when he realized that escape was impossible, but this was refused and the deputy was arrested. On March 4th, the chief of the political police issued a report stating that insofar as the investigation has up to now produced results giving rise to well-founded suspicion of the complicity of third persons, in the interests of the pending prosecution and of the security of the state, no statement can be made. So that on March 1st, grave suspicion rests on Torgler and Koenen, and the security of the state does not prevent the announcement of the grounds for this suspicion. On March 4th, any information bearing on the grounds for suspicion would endanger the security of the state. This is the second contradiction. In the Pressedienst message of March 1st, which has already been quoted, it is stated that Torgler and Koenen left the Reichstag building at about 10 p.m. According to the messages issued by the Wolf Bureau and the Telegrafen Union and the foreign correspondents, the fire was discovered in the time between 9 and 9:15 p.m. At 9:15, the fire brigade started operations. At about the same time, the police surrounded the Reichstag and prevented any access to it. A few minutes after the fire had been discovered, Göring arrived on the spot, and shortly after his arrival, Hitler, Goebbels, Papen, and Prince August Wilhelm also arrived. But in spite of this, the deputies Torgler and Koenen quietly left the burning Reichstag, which was cordoned off by the police and surrounded by a crowd of thousands of people, and it did not occur to anyone to ask them a single question. This is the third contradiction. A complete alibi. 2 waiters in the Aschinger restaurant, near the Friedrichstrasse station, have deposed on oath that the Reichstag deputy Torgler took his evening meal in the restaurant not later than 8:30. Torgler must therefore have left the Reichstag at the very latest soon after 8 o'clock, and not at 10 o'clock, as the official statement asserts. A sworn deposition made by the Reichstag deputy Wilhelm Koenen is printed below. This shows that Torgler and Koenen left the Reichstag that evening between 8:10 and 8:15 p.m. We give the deposition in full, because Koenen arrived at the Reichstag at about 6:30 p.m. on February 27th, and was with Torgler until 1:30 a.m. the following morning. These 2 deputies have a complete alibi, which shows that there is not a word of truth in the charge against them made by the Hitler government. Koenen's deposition is as follows. In the afternoon of February 27th, I went, as I had done almost every day of the previous week, to the police headquarters in the Alexanderplatz to see Detective Commissioner Dr. Braschwitz, in order to discuss with him further the question of releasing election material from Karl Liebknecht House. Shortly after 3 p.m., we went round to Karl Liebknecht House with some detective officers, and there a few small lots of posters, streamers, and other election material were released by the police and packed and sent out. When this had been completed at 5:40 p.m., I took leave of the detective commissioner, arranged to meet some of our helpers next day in a neighboring restaurant to organize the dispatch of further material, and then telephoned to our fraction secretariat in the Reichstag, as I had to discuss some points in connection with the distribution of speakers for the last week of the election campaign. Following on this telephone conversation, I went direct to the Reichstag for the purpose stated, reaching there shortly before 6:30. There I met my colleague Ernst Torgler, who, as chairman of the official election committee of our party, was concerned in the allocation of party members of the Reichstag to the meetings which had been arranged. At about 7:15 p.m. I had settled the business I had come for, and Torgler asked me to visit a few minutes for him, as he was only waiting for a telephone call which would soon be through. Then we could go and have a meal together. I then told him of the constant difficulties which were being made over the release of election material from Karl Liebknecht House. We agreed that Torgler, as head of the party's Central Election Committee, should telephone to Dr. Diels, head of the political section of the Berlin police, to lodge a further protest against the withholding of election posters and other election material. This conversation with Dr. Diels took place at about 7:30 p.m. Following on this, I got myself put through to the assessor, who, as Dr. Diels' right-hand man, was responsible for handing over the material, and put my point of view as to the difficulties which were being created, also discussing what had to be done the following day, in connection with which I had already made a further appointment to meet the detective commissioner at Karl Liebknecht House. After this telephone conversation with police headquarters, Torgler had another telephone conversation, at about 7:45, with the lawyer Dr. Rosenfeld. Then, as the call from a party friend, which he had been expecting since 7 o'clock, still did not come through, he telephoned down to the porter at door 5, and asked him, in the event of a call coming through to him after 8, when the exchange in the Reichstag is closed, to call him down on the internal telephone from the fraction secretariat room. Meanwhile, the cloakroom attendant at the south door telephoned to ask whether Herr Torgler was now leaving, or whether his hat and coat should be brought up as usual to the secretariat room. Torgler asked for his things to be brought up to him, and this was done at about 8 o'clock. At 8 o'clock the cloakroom and door 2 are closed. Then at last, at a couple minutes past 8, the call which we had been waiting for came through, and had to be dealt with by the porter at door 5, the only door still open. Torgler was called down on the house telephone, and naturally, having to come down from the 3rd floor and not wanting to keep his friend waiting unnecessarily, he lost no time over getting down. A few minutes later, Torgler returned from the porter's office direct to the fraction room, and soon after that we put on our things, and together with the woman secretary of the fraction, left the Reichstag through door 5 at perhaps 8:15. So far from leaving the building in flight, as is alleged, it so happened that we left the Reichstag building that evening at a much slower pace than we had ever done before. The secretary of the fraction, who went out with us that night, was suffering from an inflamed vein, which made it difficult for her to walk, so that we went at a snail's pace. It was at this very slow pace that we walked to the Friedrichstrasse station, where the secretary left us, and went down to the underground. We went straight, that is, therefore, at about 8:30, to the Aschinger restaurant at the Friedrichstrasse station, where we had supper. There we met 3 other party friends, and stayed for some time talking to them. 2 of these friends left us after they had had a meal, somewhere between 9:30 and 10:15. At 10 o'clock there was a change of shifts for the waiters, so we paid our bills shortly before 10. It was already past 10 o'clock when the new waiter came to our table and, addressing me by name, said, "Herr Koenen, have you heard? The Reichstag is on fire." I was astounded, and replied, "Man, are you mad? It's quite impossible." He answered excitedly, "No, it's true. All the taxi drivers say so. You can ask them at the counter by the door. Thousands of people are already collected there." Thus it was that we came to learn of one of the most monstrous crimes in the history of the world. Signed, William Koenen. This affidavit exposes the 4th contradiction in the official reports. The message issued by the Preußische Präsident of March 1st, 1933, states that Torgler did not present himself at police headquarters, but that he was arrested. The deposition printed below, which was given on oath by the barrister Dr. Kurt Rosenfeld, who accompanied Torgler to police headquarters, shows that this statement is untrue. On the morning after the burning of the Reichstag, Herr Ernst Torgler rang me up on the telephone and asked me whether I was willing to go with him to police headquarters, where he intended to go in order to rebut the charges which had been made against him in connection with the Reichstag fire. I expressed my willingness to go with him, and at once telephoned to police headquarters to inform them that I should be coming at once with Torgler. If I remember rightly, I spoke to an official of the name of Heller, then drove to police headquarters in a car with Torgler, and asked to see Herr Heller, to whom I said, "This is Herr Torgler, and I must ask you to question him in connection with the charge that he is supposed to have had some sort of connection with the Reichstag fire." The news that Torgler had presented himself voluntarily to be interrogated brought several police officers into the room where I was, asking, "Is it true that Torgler has come of his own accord?" Herr Heller then went with Herr Torgler into another room, while I waited in the anteroom. After a long time Herr Torgler came out of the room again, and we waited together until Herr Heller called us both into another room, and in my presence declared that Torgler was under arrest. Signed, Kurt Rosenfeld. This is the fifth contradiction. The Preußische Präsident of March 1st reported that Deputy Torgler had been several hours in company with the incendiary in the Reichstag building, and that he had also been in the company of other persons implicated in the fire. If Torgler had really been an accomplice, the most elementary common sense would have prevented him from showing himself in public with van der Lubbe. This is the sixth contradiction. The statement issued by the official Preußische Präsident on March 1st asserts that the communist deputies of the Reichstag were familiar with the Reichstag building and with the duty arrangements of the staff. In fact, the communist deputies of the Reichstag were not familiar with the duty arrangements of the staff, as they had no seat on the presidium of the Reichstag and were moreover excluded from all committees which dealt with the administration of the Reichstag building. And, moreover, as we shall show, on the day of the burning of the Reichstag, the duty arrangements of the staff had been altered by the National Socialist House inspector, so that although Göring, president of the Reichstag, was in a position to know about this alteration, the communist deputies could not have known of it. This is the seventh contradiction. Van der Lubbe not a communist. The official President's messages of February 28th state that van der Lubbe stated that he was a member of the Dutch Communist Party. The version broadcast on the wireless that van der Lubbe had had on him a membership card of the Dutch Communist Party was dropped even on the night of the Reichstag fire because it was too incredible. The first journalist who interviewed van der Lubbe after the burning of the Reichstag was the reporter of the Amsterdam paper De Telegraaf, whose message was published in his paper on March 2nd. Marinus tells me that for some years now he's not been a member of any party. He is not a convinced communist. In fact, Marinus van der Lubbe resigned from the Young Communist League of Leiden in April 1931 in order to forestall his expulsion. This is the eighth contradiction. The Wolf Telegraph Bureau reported from Amsterdam on March 2nd. The attempt made by the Dutch communists to repudiate van der Lubbe cannot succeed, for police headquarters in The Hague have information that Lubbe was not expelled but merely removed from the front line and given the cold shoulder because his radical ideas did not suit the cautious party leadership in Holland. The German authorities wanted to create the impression that a communist who had been given the cold shoulder by the Dutch Communist Party. In reality, van der Lubbe had not been a member of the Young Communist League since April 1931, was used by the Germanist Communist Party for terrorist acts. Was it not the National Socialists who had been for years asserting that the closest links existed between the communist parties, which are all only sections of the Communist International? How then can it be imagined that a Dutch communist who had been given the cold shoulder would be received by the German communist leaders with open arms and entrusted with the most confidential work? That is the ninth contradiction. The same report by the Wolf Telegraph Bureau goes on to say, as recently as December 22, 1932, Lube took part in a meeting of taxi drivers in The Hague who were on strike and made a long communist speech. This information given by the Dutch police is indeed extremely important in its bearing on the Reichstag fire. In the meeting of taxi drivers, van der Lubbe did not make a communist speech, but, as he had frequently done before, attacked the Dutch Communist Party. We have definite evidence of this in a signed statement made by A. Terro, a member of the staff of the Tribune, and countersigned by a number of other persons present at the meeting. This is the 10th contradiction. The statement made by the chief of the political police on March 4th asserted that van der Lubbe knew German. Statements by everyone who knew him, and also the statements made by the journalists who visited him in prison and spoke to him, are all unanimous that van der Lubbe only speaks broken German. The Local Anzeiger of February 28th states that van der Lubbe was interrogated with the aid of an interpreter. This is the 11th contradiction. The same statement made by the chief of the political police says, van der Lubbe is also known to the police as a communist agitator. On April 28, 1931, he was arrested by the police in Kronau in Westphalia for selling postcards of communist tendency. In actual fact, van der Lubbe did sell postcards at Gronau in Westphalia. They were postcards of himself and his friend Hovelde. The postcards bear the following text in 4 languages: Workers' Sports and Study Tour of Marinus van der Lubbe and H. Hovelde through Europe and the Soviet Union. Start of the tour from Leiden, April 14, 1931. There is not another word on the card, not the slightest indication of communist agitation. Van der Lubbe was arrested merely because he had no license to sell the cards on the street. This is the 12th contradiction. The chief of the Berlin political police further stated, he, van der Lubbe, in his examination, only admitted the true facts of the case insofar as he was confronted with witnesses. A few lines lower down, the same report says, he, van der Lubbe, confessed every detail. No names of eyewitnesses of the act of incendiarism have been given by the Hitler government. Even the official Preußische Präsident did not assert that van der Lubbe had been seen setting fire to the Reichstag by the police or anyone else. And if this is so, then, according to the statement issued by the chief of the political police, he did not make any confession. On the other hand, the same police official states that van der Lubbe confessed every detail. This is the 13th contradiction. The so-called national press, which is inspired by the police, announced the day after the Reichstag fire that van der Lubbe had been in Moscow and had been trained there. In reality, van der Lubbe had never been in the Soviet Union. He went direct from Leiden to Germany. This is the 14th contradiction. Van der Lubbe left Leiden between the 13th and the 15th of February. According to a statement published in the Vossische Zeitung of March 2, 1933, he spent the night of the 17th through the 18th of February in a hostel at Glindau near Werden. On February 18th, he went on foot to Berlin. In an interview which the criminal commissioner Heise gave to the Dutch press on March 13th, he stated that van der Lubbe had made the acquaintance of communists at labor exchanges, and through them was brought into the Communist Action Committee. Van der Lubbe did not arrive in Berlin until the evening of Saturday, February 18th at the earliest. On the Sunday following, February 19th, the labor exchanges were closed. If the statement made by the police is correct, therefore, he could not have made the acquaintance of communists at a labor exchange before Monday, February 20th, at the earliest. The reader must imagine for himself. A Dutchman, speaking broken German without any transfer papers from the Dutch Communist Party, on February 20th makes the acquaintance of communists at a labor exchange in Berlin, is brought by them into contact with the leaders of the party, and commissioned by them to set fire to the Reichstag on February 27th. This is the 15th contradiction. A statement issued by the official Preußische Pressedienst of March 1st says, "The arrested man has been continuously present at the meetings of the Communist Action Committee and was drawn in to carry out this act of incendiarism." On March 3rd, the Central Committee of the German Communist Party made the following statement in reply. Of course, no meetings of any Communist Action Committee have been held in the Reichstag or elsewhere at which the man arrested in the Reichstag, van der Lubbe, was present. In the first place, no Communist Action Committee exists, but only the Central Committee of the German Communist Party and its political bureau. In the second place, no individuals take part in meetings of the Communist Party or of any of its units who are not members of either the German Communist Party or of some other section of the Comintern. This reply to Göring's assertions reveals the 16th contradiction. Catacombs in Karl Liebknecht House. A statement issued by the official Preußische Pressedienst on February 28, 1933, says, "Among the 100 centners of material which the police discovered in their search of the Karl Liebknecht house were instructions for the carrying out of the Communist terror on the Bolshevik model. According to these instructions, government buildings, museums, mansions and essential plant were to be burnt down. The further direction is given that in riots and conflicts, women and children are to be put in front of the terrorist troops. If possible, the wives and children of police officials. The discovery of this material has checked the systematic carrying through of the Bolshevik revolution." The Reichstag deputy Wilhelm Koenen, who was constantly working in the Karl Liebknecht house during the last few days of February as a leading official of the Communist Party, describes the searches in Karl Liebknecht house as follows. In the forenoon of February 17th, a gigantic crowd of detective officers, accompanied by several companies of ordinary police, rushed into the building and occupied every room. Every corner, every cupboard was thoroughly searched. They had taken the precaution of bringing skilled workers with them to take to pieces the desks, for which there were no keys. All the cellars, too, were carefully searched. In the cellars, as usual, there was only the material which had been left over from various campaigns, or had been returned to the office in the course of years. In the basement rooms there were also supplies of paper and bookshop stocks. On that occasion the police inspector still considered it necessary, at my request, to show me any papers confiscated as suspicious, and to state that they were confiscated or to give me a receipt for them. Among the papers seized in the course of this exhaustive search, which lasted many hours, there was neither the book The Art of Armed Insurrection nor any other so-called seditious publication. Nor was there any mention of these in the police reports issued immediately after the raid. It was only a week later, on February 24th, although I had been almost every day with police inspectors in the Karl Liebknecht house in connection with getting out election material, that police headquarters suddenly asserted that in the course of a new search in the so-called catacombs seditious material had been found, including the book The Art of Armed Insurrection. This alleged new search, if it took place at all, must have been carried out without any civilian witnesses, and without any representative of the people concerned being present. This is all the more significant as I had been practically every day in the Karl Liebknecht house negotiating with police inspectors to recover election material, paper, books, and so forth, and getting them dispatched. Although I was therefore available every day, I was neither summoned nor even informed when the alleged discovery was made. It would have been particularly easy to inform me of it, as I was there on the 24th, on Saturday the 25th, and again on Monday the 27th, and was talking to detectives and inspectors in connection with the delivery of the material recovered from the police. On February 25th, after the report of the passages, vaults, and catacombs had already appeared in heavy type in the great press, when I had finished with the inspector in charge in connection with the release of election material, I asked him where the catacombs were. A number of comrades who were helping with the dispatch of the election material were also present. He then, to our surprise, pointed to a trap door about a yard wide in a room on the ground floor, which was used as a porter's office. The trap door was raised so that we could see a ladder leading down into the basement. A comrade who had worked in the building for many years and knew it well said, "Man, that's the trap door to our old beer cellar." We all laughed and asked the same question. "Is that supposed to be the catacombs?" The inspector answered only with a rather embarrassed nod. That part of the building used to be an inn. The explanation of the passages through which people were supposed to be able to get away to other streets is equally simple. Karl Liebknecht House is a corner house, which as an office building for commercial undertakings had storerooms and working rooms in the basement, and these were described by Goering's police as vaults, passages, and catacombs. These two statements expose the 17th contradiction in the official reports. Signal for civil war, the Preußische Präsidentei announced on February 28th. The burning of the Reichstag was to be the signal for a bloody insurrection and civil war. Looting on a large scale had been organized for Tuesday in Berlin. It has been ascertained that today was to have seen throughout Germany terrorist acts against individual persons, against private property, and against the life and limb of the peaceful population, and also the beginning of general civil war. The Vossische Zeitung of March 4, 1933 reported, "The work of the police has up to the present prevented the material being put into the hands of every communist. It has only got into the hands of a few functionaries in secret communications." The last search of Karl Liebknecht House took place on February 24th. It was on this occasion that the terrorist material is alleged to have been found. The political police state that the instructions for the terror did not reach all communists, but were only known to a few functionaries, so that the German Communist Party would have had to circulate through every area in Germany in the 3 days between February 24th and 27th, the materials stored in the Karl Liebknecht House. Secondly, within the same 3 days, it would have had to get together the special groups who were to carry out the terrorist acts. Thirdly, it would have had to instruct and train these groups to carry out the terrorist acts. And fourthly, it would have had to prepare and organize the rest of the members for the civil war, which was to be unleashed through these terrorist acts. In February 1933, the German Communist Party had over 300,000 members, distributed all over Germany. The party would have had to work miracles to organize within 3 days for the carrying through of all the plans attributed to it by the official statements. This is the 18th contradiction. The incriminating material has not been produced. During the evening of March 1st, the official Preußische Präsidentei issued the following announcement. The Prussian Ministry of the Interior states, in connection with the decree issued by the Reich government against the communist danger, dated February 28th, that particularly heavy penalties have been imposed for a number of crimes, because of the grave and acute danger which has been fully established, and of the inhuman and carefully prepared system of unrestricted communist terror. Germany was to have been thrown into the chaos of Bolshevism. The assassination of individual leaders of the nation and of the state, outrages against essential services and public persons, the seizure as hostages of the wives and children of prominent men, were to produce fear and dismay among the nation, and cripple any attempt at resistance on the part of the citizens. The Reich Commissioner for the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, Minister Goering, will in the very near future make public the documents which prove the necessity of all the measures which have been taken. The enormous amount of material is being sifted once again, and a final examination of it is being made with a view to ensuring that the security of the state cannot be further endangered by its publication. Up to the present time, the documents have not been published. This is the 19th contradiction. Goering denies his own statement. On March 2, 1933, the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung and the Tägliche Rundschau published the following messages from the official Preußische Pressedienst. In certain foreign newspapers, the slanderous assertion, emanating from German Marxist circles, is being circulated that the fire in the Reichstag building was organized not by communists, but from the National Socialist side. The originators of this slander have already been arrested, and will be brought to due punishment as soon as the investigation has been completed. Among other things, it is asserted that the Dutch communist who was arrested is in reality an agent provocateur, and was induced to carry out the act of incendiarism by leading National Socialists. This is supposed to be proved by the fact that the criminal had used his coat and shirt as inflammable material, but had not even removed the communist documents and his passports which were found on him. Significance is further attached to the fact that the police authorities have not published the photograph of the incendiary and the documents found on him, and have also offered no reward for persons who could give further information about the criminal and establish his connections with communist and social democratic politicians. This unusual procedure in an important criminal case is supposed to be evidence that the authorities are hindering the elucidation of the crime, in order to be able to use a National Socialist act of provocation as a pretext for anti-Marxist measures. In reply to this, it is stated from official sources that these slanderous arguments are of course devoid of any basis. The photographs of the criminal and of the documents found on him have not yet been published, purely in the interest of the investigation. Publication will take place in the course of today. Moreover, the Berlin correspondents of foreign newspapers can obtain the photographic reproductions in the course of today from the IA department at police headquarters. The photograph of the criminal will also be handed today to the Dutch police in order to confirm the criminal's identity. This will remove the possibility of further slanders. A specific warning is issued against the dissemination of such slanders. But before the other German papers could publish this announcement, its publication was forbidden. Goering instructed the Wolf Bureau to circulate a statement that the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung and the Tägliche Rundschau had been taken in by a communist forgery. Apparently, Goering wanted to make people believe that anyone can simply ring up a newspaper and say, "Preußische Pressedienst speaking," and then secure publicity for any kind of story. In reality, telephone messages from press agencies to newspapers are very strictly controlled. Before accepting any message, the editorial stenographer first asks for confirmation from the control. Goering's dementi cannot cause any doubt as to the fact that at first he intended, through the Preußische Pressedienst, to bluff the world, and then later, too late, realized the danger of the message and tried to hold it back. This is the 20th contradiction. End of Chapter 4, Part 2. Chapter 4, Part 3 of the Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lawrence Trask, Mount Vernon, Ohio. InterfaceAudio.com. Brown Book of the Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 4, Part 3. The Hunt for Accomplices. The Conti service of the official Wolf Telegraph Bureau announced on March 4, 1933, that the Communist Reichstag deputy Schumann, at a Communist election meeting at Garen, Thuringia, on February 24th, foretold the burning of the Reichstag building. Schumann's actual words are reported to have been, "This evening the Reichstag will be in flames, but that makes no difference. If this dance hall is burnt down, then we will get a swung floor." The Vossische Zeitung of March 5, 1933 states, "A report was sent out from Thuringia and further broadcast by wireless to the effect that the district authorities in Arnstadt in Thuringia were in possession of a report relating to a communist election meeting held at Garen on the evening of the wicked act of arson in the building of the German Reichstag. That the local police official who was present at the meeting recorded in his report a statement made by the speaker, the Communist Reichstag deputy Schumann, in which the fire in the Reichstag was foretold in advance. Investigations since made have, however, as the Thüringer Allgemeine Zeitung now states, shown that there is a wireless apparatus in the restaurant where the meeting was held, and that the landlord, on the basis of the radio announcement, had sent to tell the speaker in the course of his speech that the Reichstag was on fire. It has been established that the police officer concerned made an error of 1 hour in his report, and that Schumann only began his speech at about 10:15 p.m. It can therefore be taken for granted that he had already heard of the radio announcement that the Reichstag was on fire. This is the 21st contradiction. On March 7, 1933, the Vossische Zeitung stated on the basis of information received from the police: During 6/3, in the German village of Lammerdorf, near the Belgian frontier, a Russian emigrant was arrested yesterday evening on suspicion of having been concerned in the burning of the Reichstag. Shortly before his arrest, he had dispatched a telegram from a Belgian post office to Paris, the content of which cannot as yet be disclosed. On being sent back across the frontier by Belgian frontier guards, he was arrested on this side of the frontier. He admitted during his interrogation that he came originally from Russia and had been living for some time in Berlin. He had severe burns on his arms and legs. The mysterious foreigner was today handed over to the criminal authorities. He obstinately refuses to say anything more regarding his activities in the capital of the Reich, and up to the present has not even given his name. On March 8, 1933, the Vossische Zeitung printed a statement received from the authorities at Aix-la-Chapelle. Not an accomplice of the Reichstag incendiary. The authorities of Aix-la-Chapelle state that the Russian citizen who was arrested near Freundshaus as an incendiary, as investigations have shown, cannot be implicated. The man concerned has been active as a journalist in the Communist Party. For this reason he was expelled from the country a year ago, but there is no further evidence against him. His expulsion has been carried out. This is the 22nd contradiction. Did van der Lubbe alone start the fire? Early in March, the Hitler government sent Heysek, a detective commissioner, to Leiden to make investigations regarding van der Lubbe's antecedents. Heysek gave an interview to representatives of the Dutch press, which was published in a number of papers on March 14th. This contains the following: As for the important questions whether Lubbe had assistants or accomplices, it is probable that he alone started the fire, but that the preparatory measures had been carried out by accomplices. This statement absolutely contradicts the official statement made on March 1st, that the simultaneous lighting of the fire at so many points in the gigantic building must have required at least 10 persons. The judge in charge of the investigation, Voigt, therefore hastened to deny on March 15th the statement made by Heysek. A report has been published in a number of papers that van der Lubbe started the fire in the Reichstag by himself. This is not correct. The investigation conducted by the court has given good reason to believe that van der Lubbe did not commit the crime on his own initiative. In the interests of the investigation, details cannot at present be given. This is the 23rd contradiction. Lubbe's connections with the Social Democrats. The official Preußische Pressedienst of February 28th gave the information that in his confession van der Lubbe had admitted to connections with the Social Democratic Party. On February 28th, The executive of the Social Democratic Party issued a statement in the following terms. During the night of the 27th, 28th February, the whole Social Democratic press of Prussia was prohibited for 14 days. The prohibition is based on the statement that an arrested man has confessed that he started the fire in the Reichstag building and had previously had a certain connection with the Social Democratic Party. The suggestion that the Social Democratic Party would have anything to do with people who set fire to the Reichstag is repudiated by the party. This statement issued by the executive of the Social Democratic Party was confirmed by a statement made by the examining magistrate, Judge Voigt, which was published on March 22, 1933. The investigation has so far shown that the Dutch communist van der Lubbe, who was arrested as the person who set fire to the Reichstag building, was in communication immediately before the fire, not only with German communists, but also with foreign communists, including some who had been condemned to death or to long terms of penal servitude in connection with the explosion in the Sofia Cathedral in 1925. The persons concerned are now under arrest. The investigation has not produced the slightest grounds for believing that non-communist circles had any connection with the burning of the Reichstag. On February 27th, van der Lubbe is said to have admitted connections with the Social Democrats. On March 22nd, there were not the slightest grounds for believing this assertion. This is the 24th contradiction. Van der Lubbe and the Bulgarians. In the statement referred to above, Judge Voigt declares that van der Lubbe had connections with the people responsible for the Sofia Cathedral explosion. Van der Lubbe had therefore not only performed the miracle of establishing, within 7 days, connections with the leaders of the German Communist Party, through communists whom he got to know by accident at a labor exchange. He also succeeded, within these 7 days, in getting into touch with Bulgarians who are said to have been responsible for the Sofia Cathedral explosion. This is the 25th contradiction. The Bulgarians who were arrested and charged with complicity in the burning of the Reichstag are Dimitrov, Popov, and Tanev. George Dimitrov was one of the theoretical leaders of the Bulgarian Communist Party. In 1923, he took part in the rising of the Bulgarian workers, and in 1924 he was sentenced in contumaciam to 15 years hard labor. He has not been in Bulgaria since 1923. He had no part whatever in the Sofia Cathedral explosion. Bourgeois Popov emigrated to Yugoslavia in 1924, and only returned to Bulgaria at the end of 1930. He also was not concerned in the Sofia Cathedral explosion of 1925. The third arrested Bulgarian, Tanev, is merely a worker, who was not in any way concerned in the Sofia Cathedral explosion. The aim of the assertion that the arrested Bulgarians had blown up the Sofia Cathedral is quite clear. The Hitler government hoped to produce the impression that the burning of the Reichstag was an international communist plot. This is the 26th contradiction. The judge in charge of the investigation asserted that Dimitrov had been seen with van der Lubbe at 3 p.m. on February 26th in a restaurant in the Düsseldorferstrasse. The judge also produced a witness who swore that he had seen van der Lubbe with Dimitrov on that date. But the witness disappeared into oblivion shortly afterwards, for Dimitrov was able to prove that on February 26th he had not been in Berlin at all, but in Munich. This is the 27th contradiction. No material for a great communist trial. On March 27th, Judge Voigt stated that a criminal warrant had so far been issued only against van der Lubbe, but on April 3rd he caused a statement to be circulated that in all 5 warrants had been issued in connection with the burning of the Reichstag, for van der Lubbe, 3 Bulgarian communists, and the Communist Reichstag deputy, Torgler. Torgler was arrested on February 28th. the Bulgarians on March 3rd. Up to March 27th, that is to say during the period when the main inquiries were being made, no warrants had been issued for Torgler and the Bulgarians. The warrants were issued only when the announcement that the only criminal warrant issued was for van der Lubbe had created a sensation in the press of the world. This is the 28th contradiction. Judge Voigt's statement of April 3rd says that for the time being, only warrants for protective arrest have been issued in respect of a few other suspected persons. On June 2nd, it was officially announced that the preliminary investigation conducted by Judge Voigt against the accused van der Lubbe, Torgler, Dimitrov, Popov, and Tanev on charges of setting fire to the Reichstag and high treason was concluded on June 1st. All the documents have now been sent to the Reich Public Prosecutor at Leipzig. On April 3rd, there were still a few other suspected persons. On June 1st, they are no longer there. This is the 29th contradiction. On April 22nd, Judge Voigt authorized the following official statement with regard to the progress of the investigation. The Supreme Court proposes to combine the investigation in the many pending cases of high treason against members of the Communist Party into one single inquiry on a large scale. It is expected that the investigations will be concluded in 8 to 10 weeks, so that then all the cases of high treason can be dealt with together by the Supreme Court. The cases concerned are all those arising in connection with the change of government in Germany, that is to say, all crimes during the course of January and February. This will also include the proceedings connected with the act of incendiarism in the Reichstag. This case has so far not made very rapid progress, owing to the fact that the accused, and particularly the Bulgarians, refused to make any statement. The grounds for suspicion of complicity against the Reichstag deputy Torgler have been more securely established. A month later, on May 25th, there was no longer any talk of a great communist trial. The Hitler government was forced to issue, through a parliamentary news bureau, the News, that the trial in connection with the act of incendiarism in the Reichstag will be associated with other cases against communist leaders in a great communist trial, as has been suggested, is not to be expected. The trial of van der Lubbe and his accomplices will come before the Supreme Court as soon as the necessary preliminary labors have been concluded. This is the 30th contradiction. The Völkischer Beobachter, Hitler's official organ, published the following statement on March 3rd as coming from an official source. The chief of the press section of the National Socialist fraction in the Reichstag discovered a missing pane of the glass roof over the room of the Communist deputy Torgler, and after further search discovered a long ladder above it, lying against the window of a Communist deputy's room in the second upper story. Detective inspectors immediately instituted a thorough search, for it was here that the incendiaries must have come down before the crime, or got up again after the crime. On March 1st, Goering had declared that the incendiaries had got away through the underground passage, which connects the Reichstag building with Goering's house. This declaration of his confirmed what many people thought, that the Reichstag incendiaries had made their way into the Reichstag through his house, and had escaped through his house. In order to weaken the overwhelming impression caused by Goering's declaration, the chief of the press section of the Nazi fraction in the Reichstag was sent to discover a missing pane and a ladder. The detective force, after 3 days' thorough search, had failed to see what the sharp eyes of the leader of the press section discovered in a moment. This is the 31st contradiction. Van der Lubbe confesses what is required. Dr. Oberfohren stated in his memorandum that Goebbels' plan was to start a series of incendiary acts, which were to culminate in the burning of the Reichstag. For incendiary acts, incendiaries are necessary. Van der Lubbe confesses that he set fire to the Reichstag. Van der Lubbe confesses that on February 25th He tried to set fire to the Berliner Schloss. In connection with this, the press of February 27th reported, "It has only now become known that a small fire broke out on Saturday in an office room on the 5th floor of the Berliner Schloss, which was quickly put out by a fireman stationed on the premises. The origin of the fire is not yet fully explained, but it is thought to have been an act of incendiarism." An hour before the fire started, the caretaker had started his round through the Schloss, and had even passed through that room. At the time there was nothing suspicious to be seen. Soon afterwards the room was in flames. Investigation showed that there was a burning firelighter on the window sill, and another under the window, and also on the steam pipes. The police investigation has not yet been concluded. Van der Lubbe confesses that on February 25th he tried to start a fire in the welfare office in Neukölln. Van der Lubbe confesses that on February 25th he made an attempt to start a fire in the Berlin town hall. This Van der Lubbe is a real child of the devil. To start fires on one day in 3 different places in Berlin. And he is a man who only speaks German brokenly. He had only arrived in Berlin on February 18, 1933. 7 days later he had sufficient knowledge of the place to start fires in the Schloss, in the town hall, and in the welfare office. He only required 9 days to learn enough about the Reichstag to enable him to walk in and out as if it were his own house. Van der Lubbe had to appear as a dyed-in-the-blood communist. Such a communist, as conceived by Dr. Goebbels, must have a forged passport. Consequently, Van der Lubbe must make some alteration in his name on the passport. The passport was forged by putting 2 dots over the U, changing it into a U. Van der Lubbe was only too willing to take communist leaflets into the Reichstag with him. Certainly, no criminal has ever met the police so completely equipped with credentials. A talk with Torgler the day before the Reichstag fire. As chairman of the communist fraction in the Reichstag, Ernst Torgler was often called upon to answer enquiries from the press and from journalists. At a press conference on February 24th, he told the journalists present that the communists had information of an act of provocation planned by the Nazis. He stated that among other plans there was talk of staging an attempt to assassinate Hitler. The whole of the foreign press and a section of the German press published Torgler's statement. Shortly after this conference, the parliamentary correspondent of the Vossische Zeitung, Adolf Philippsborn, arranged an interview with Torgler, and an account of this interview written by Philippsborn was published in the Gegenangriff of July 1, 1933. It runs as follows. As a parliamentary journalist, I have for many years been in contact with deputies belonging to all parties in the Reichstag. It so chanced that I had arranged an interview with Torgler on February 26, 24 hours before the Reichstag fire. Torgler came with his daughter, who is 11 years of age. As the head of his party fraction, I showed him some material on the secret plans of the National Socialists. We then talked for about 2 hours about the whole political situation. I have never been a sympathizer with the Communist Party, and I referred to a number of weaknesses of the party. Torgler admitted some of the points, but energetically defended the general standpoint of his political friends. Finally, I put the following question to him. There is a rumor going about that the Communists propose to take some action against the Nazi government before the Reichstag elections, March 5th. Is this true? Torgler: that is nonsense. The government is only waiting for an opportunity to prohibit the Communist Party. Will the Communist leaders call a strike? Torgler: of course we are calling for a political mass strike as a means of struggle against fascist acts of violence. But we know that this can only be successful if the trade unions withdraw their opposition and line up with us in a fighting front. Can this interview then be summed up by saying that the Communist Party does not intend to take any action which could give the Nazi government the occasion for an offensive against the Marxist working class. Torgler, emphatically and with conviction: yes, that is the position. We Communists know that by ourselves we are too weak for the fight. We know that Hitler, Goering and his colleagues are only waiting for some pretext which will give them the opportunity to prohibit the Communist Party and cancel the mandates of party deputies elected to the Reichstag. We know that we are shadowed by spies and that our telephone conversations are listened to. We are not going to run into the trap these gentlemen have prepared for us. On the evening following this conversation, the Reichstag was in flames, and a few hours later Torgler had been arrested as the criminal. I then had the conviction, and still have it, that Torgler told me the absolute truth, and for that reason, although I am an opponent of communism, I am prepared to say it to anyone, including Herr Goering, who knows it better than I do, and to the judges at the trial: hands off Ernst Torgler. He is not guilty. The proof of the Nazis' guilt. The contradictions in which the Hitler government became entangled in its accounts of the Reichstag fire are by themselves enough to show who were the real incendiaries. But apart from these contradictions, there is direct evidence that the National Socialists were guilty of this act of incendiarism. We do not propose to print here all the evidence which we have at our disposal, but only the most important and striking parts of it. The fire in the German Reichstag was discovered at 9:15. The mass arrests in Berlin began soon after midnight. Almost all the warrants were accompanied with photographs of the accused, and the date of issue was inserted in ink. On February 28th, approximately 1,500 persons were arrested in Berlin alone. Is it possible to fill out 1,500 warrants, sign them, and in the majority of cases attach photographs to them, in 3 hours? Information which we have received from dismissed police officials provides the explanation of this promptness. The warrants were got ready during the days immediately preceding the burning of the Reichstag. Only the date was not filled in. By the morning of February 27th, all the warrants were ready. They were signed before the date was filled in. On February 22nd, the Prussian government decided to strengthen the police with auxiliary police. Only members of the so-called national associations, that is, of the National Socialist storm troops and of the Stahlhelm, were allowed to join the auxiliary police. While the control of the auxiliary police was left in the hands of the local authorities, the Minister of the Interior, Goering, reserved to himself the right to control them in Berlin itself. The decision was made public on February 27th, the date of the Reichstag fire. In the first official announcement of the Reichstag fire, Goering triumphantly stated that the organization of the auxiliary police, for which he was responsible, had proved to be justified and necessary. The National Socialist leaders and ministers were not content with setting up the auxiliary police. On February 27th, the whole of the storm troop forces in Berlin were confined to their quarters in barracks. A member of the storm troops, who left Germany at the end of March, gave the following information to the Paris Intransigent. At noon on February 27th, we received the orders to remain in our quarters until further notice. We were strictly forbidden to show ourselves in groups in the streets. Only our collectors were allowed out with their collecting boxes, and a few others were sent on special errands. We did not know what was in the wind, and we waited until suddenly at 10 o'clock in the evening the order came: all at the double to the Brandenburger Tor. Leave your weapons. You are wanted for cordon duty. The Reichstag is on fire. The Berlin leader Ernst collected a few of us in the tavern at the corner of the Wilhelmstrasse and the Dorotheenstrasse. He instructed us to go to various parts of town and to spread in the beer houses and at the street corners the story that the Communists had set fire to the Reichstag, that definite evidence had been found. In short, the whole story as it appeared in the press the following day. At that time it was not yet known that van der Lubbe was a Dutchman, and that Deputy Torgler had been the last to leave the Reichstag. This was all told us as an absolute fact, and indeed with such definiteness that we all felt violently angry with the incendiaries. We rushed out, and carried out our tasks with the greatest zeal. The more often I told the story, the more detailed it became, and soon I felt as I had been an eyewitness of the arson. Group leader Ernst has a high position in the Hitler hierarchy, but it requires more than a group leader's intellectual powers to know, by a few minutes after 10 p.m., that Torgler had been the last to leave the Reichstag. Group leader Ernst was privy to the plan of Goebbels and Goering. He was allocated the special task of transforming the storm-troop men into heralds to spread the story of the communist incendiaries. Hitler betrays himself. On February 27, 1933, fire broke out in the German Reichstag. On February 27, 1933, although the elections campaign was at its height, the most important National Socialist leaders were in Berlin. On February 27th, Hitler did not speak at any meeting. On February 27th, Goebbels did not speak at any meeting. They were in Berlin with Goering. None of the three had any meeting or any work to do that night. A few minutes after it became known that the Reichstag was on fire, Goering made his appearance on the scene, and Hitler and Goebbels were there a few minutes later. Sefton Delmer, the Berlin correspondent of the Daily Express, one of the few English papers to back Hitler, was in their company, and the report he sent to the Daily Express is more damaging than any published by papers hostile to Hitler. Sefton Delmer describes the scene at the Reichstag, perhaps 20 to 30 minutes after the fire had been discovered. Hitler is reported as having turned to von Papen and said, "This is a God-given signal. If this fire, as I believe, turns out to be the handiwork of communists, then there is nothing that shall stop us now crushing out this murder pest with an iron fist." Then, turning to Sefton Delmer, he said, "You are witnessing the beginning of a great new epoch in German history. This fire is the beginning." The Chancellor of the Third Reich spoke these words at a time when the guilt of the Communists could not have been established, when van der Lubbe was only just being interrogated with the help of an interpreter. According to unanimous press reports, the interrogation of van der Lubbe, which began immediately after his arrest, continued into the early hours of the morning. Van der Lubbe was arrested at about 9:20 p.m. At the time when Hitler spoke the words quoted above, van der Lubbe could not have made his comprehensive confession, which might have served Hitler as the ground for his accusations against the Communists. Hitler's lack of self-control made him put the blame on the Communists a little too early. He did not wait for his cue. An ally charges the Nazis with the act of arson. The Deutsche Zeitung, the organ of heavy industry, had been demanding since 1930 that Hitler should be entrusted with the government. Heavy industry was then trying to make the German nationalists believe that Hitler would be content to share power with them. The first weeks of the national government's existence brought out the sharp contradictions within the coalition government. Oberfohren's memorandum shows these contradictions clearly. The Deutsche Zeitung tried to strengthen the position of the German nationalists. In the early stages it spared no criticism of the national government, and soon after the Reichstag fire, when the National Socialists became preponderant in the coalition government, it even went so far as to assert that Goering's statements were untrue, and to express doubts of the guilt of the Communists. On March 2nd, the following appeared in the paper. From a political standpoint, there is only one quite incomprehensible point about the Reichstag fire: that a Communist could have been found who was so foolish as to commit the crime. Apart from a few speeches, newspaper articles, and proposals put forward, up to now we have seen very little of any united front between the Communists and the Social Democrats. It is extremely improbable that such a united front could have been widened out to achieve an act of incendiarism in the German Reichstag. We fear that closer examination of the presuppositions for the well-known statement made by the Minister of the Interior will show that the charge he made cannot be maintained. If that is the case, it would have been better not to have raised it." This is not from a Marxist journal, but from the Journal of Heavy Industry. A few months after the Reichstag fire, the Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung was brought into conformity. Its chief editor was removed, not before Hugenberg also sank into the background. But though the article failed to prevent the breakup of the German Nationalist Party, it is nevertheless significant that an ally of Hitler should expose Goering's lie and cast doubt on the guilt of the Communists. Why did Goering leave the Reichstag unprotected? The messages issued by the official Preußische Pressedienst on February 28th stated that among the material found in Karl Liebknecht House there were instructions for setting fire to the Reichstag. The search of Karl Liebknecht House took place on February 24th. Already on February 24th and 25th, the whole of the bourgeois press was in an uproar over the alleged murderous plans of the Communists. The police president of Berlin made a report to Goering on February 26th on the material alleged to have been found in the catacombs of Karl Liebknecht House. As Minister of the Interior, Goering was in control of the Prussian police. As president of the Reichstag, Goering was in control of the Reichstag building. There was no one else in such a position as he was in to protect the Reichstag against any plot. There was no one whose duty to do this was greater than his. Goering neither called on the police to protect the Reichstag, nor did he take any protective measures within the Reichstag itself. If the material alleged to have been found was real, then at the very least Herr Goering was guilty of abetting the crime. The only conclusions that can be drawn from the fact that the document alleged to have been found in the Karl Liebknecht House have not yet been published, as also from the fact that Goering took no steps to protect the Reichstag, is that the material from the Karl Liebknecht House existed only in the reports in the official Preußische Pressedienst. The Communists neither intended nor did they make any preparations to set fire to the Reichstag. The incendiaries were National Socialists. Goering sends home the Reichstag officials. Goering not only took no steps to protect the Reichstag building, he also saw to it that the Reichstag officials left the Reichstag before the normal time for finishing duty. On February 27th, the National Socialist inspector of the building released the officials on duty at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The staff told him that it was contrary to the terms of their employment to leave before the end of their spell of duty. The National Socialist inspector told them to go off duty, as there was nothing to do. Early in March, the foreign press published the information that the staff of the Reichstag had been released from their duties at an early hour on February 27th. The Hitler government has not dared to deny this. Fire Brigade Director puts the blame on Goering. On March 24th, the surprising announcement was made that the Chief Fire Brigade Director of Berlin, Gempp, had been provisionally granted leave of absence, as he had tolerated communist intrigues in the service. The communist intrigues which Gempp was supposed to have tolerated consisted in the fact that in a conference with the inspectors and men of the fire brigade he had made statements in connection with the Reichstag fire, which threw a curious light on Goering's attitude at the scene of the fire. Gemp's statements concern the three following essential points. In a conference with his inspectors and officers shortly before his dismissal, Herr Gempp complained that the fire brigade had been summoned too late. This was the only explanation of why a storm troop detachment, some 20 men strong, was already on the scene of the fire by the time that the fire brigade at last appeared. Herr Gempp complained further that the Minister of the Interior, Goering, had expressly forbidden him to circulate a general call, and thereby to summon stronger forces to fight the fire. Finally, Herr Gempp had noticed that in the parts of the Reichstag building which were not destroyed, there were great masses of unused incendiary material lying about. In fact, in various rooms and under and in cupboards, etc., there was material which would have completely filled a lorry. The above report was published in the Saarbrücker Volksstimme of April 25, 1933, and thence found its way into the press of the world. Goering did not reply to the report published by the Saarbrücker Volksstimme, not even by denying that the report was true. He used it as an opportunity of accusing Gempp of disloyalty. The Deutsche Allgemeine Zeitung of April 29, 1933, reports how Goering reacted to the disclosure made by the Volksstimme. Disciplinary action against Director Gempp. We have received the following from Commissioner Dr. Lippert. Fire Brigade Director Gempp, chief of the Berlin Fire Brigade, who was provisionally granted leave of absence by Dr. Lippert, State Commissioner, was accused of having tolerated communist intrigues in the service under his control. Gempp then requested that disciplinary proceedings should be started against him. This request was not granted at the time, in view of the fact that Gempp was suspected of other offenses. Disciplinary proceedings have now been opened against him, as he is charged with dereliction of duty under Section 266 of the Criminal Code, in connection with the purchase of a motor car through one of the functionaries at that time, the Social Democrat chancellor Ahrens. It is not only in the Gempp case that the National Socialists have used the tactics of getting rid of dangerous opponents by means of criminal charges. From the charges brought by Gempp against Goering, it is clear that Goering was interested in the spreading of the fire and not in putting it out. The National Socialists intended to use the incendiary act to deal a deadly blow against Marxism. With this in view, it was necessary that the damage done by the fire should be as great and impressive as possible, and therefore it was not to be put out too soon. 3 days after the fire, the building was opened for the public to see the effect. The same National Socialist inspector of the building who had sent the staff away early on February 27th was now the official guide through the ruined building. Tens of thousands of people crowded in to see the sight. The guide explained, in an expert way, how the fire had been started by the Communists, and he did not omit to amplify his description with atrocity stories of what the Communists had intended to do. Goering, who had not the courage himself to deny what the Saarbrücker Volksstimme reported, compelled Gempp to issue a dementi. Gempp seems to have refused to do so for some time. It was only on June 18, 1933, that a statement by him appeared in the German press, in which he declared that the report published in the Volksstimme was false. There is some dementis which establish the truth of the report that is denied, and Gemp's delayed dementi is one of this kind. Under the pressure of the charges made against him, and from fear of the sentence of imprisonment with which he was threatened, Gempp gave way to Goering's threats. End of Chapter 4, Part 3.
Chapter 4, Part 4 of Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Brown Book of the Hitler Terror by Lord Marley. Chapter 4, The Real Incendiaries, Part 4. Where are the instigators of the fire? In the second March number of the conservative weekly journal Der Ring, which is edited by Heinrich von Gleichen, we find, the fire in the Reichstag led to extremely severe countermeasures by the government of the Reich. The authorities are maintaining a state of preparedness for all eventualities. The public and the leading articles in the press are asking, how is it possible? Are we then really a nation of blind hens? Where are the instigators of this fire, whose results show how sure they were of their aims? To give a single answer to all questions, we must say in all seriousness and to the point, we have no secret service, such as the English and other nations have, If we had such an institution, then we should by now know exactly where the instigators of the Reichstag fire were to be found. In fact, we should already know the actual persons. They are perhaps members of the best German international society. Heinrich von Gleichen is one of the most influential members of the Herren Club. Since Papen was chancellor, von Gleichen has been one of the wire pullers of the government's policy. His connections with the President's palace are more than excellent. In the extract quoted by us from The Ring, von Gleichen openly charges the Hitler government with not having done anything to clear up the Reichstag fire. He asks, where are the instigators of this fire, whose results show how sure they were of their aims? Can anything else be meant by this than that the National Socialists organized the fire in order confidently to win one position of power after the other? After this issue, the Ring was prohibited. Dr. Bell tells tales out of school. Elsewhere in this book, an exact account is given of Dr. Bell's death at the hands of the Nazis. Here we deal only with his role in connection with the Reichstag fire. We do not propose to rely on the reports which state that before the Reichstag fire, between 8 and 9 on February 27th, Dr. Bell told English and American journalists that the Reichstag was on fire. This statement was deliberately circulated by the Hitler government. The Nazis wanted a favorable opportunity for a dementi, and for thus discrediting what Dr. Bell had really stated. Dr. Bell knew van der Lubbe very well, and he was also kept closely informed by van der Lubbe of the connections he had formed with Nazi circles in Munich and Berlin. Although for about a year Dr. Bell had been hostile to the National Socialist Party, he still had a number of men within the party who kept him informed. He knew exactly what had taken place in connection with the Reichstag fire. In the National Club in the Friedrich-Ebert-Strasse on March 3rd or 4th, Bell betrayed what he knew about the Reichstag fire to a politician belonging to the People's Party. This politician wrote to some of his friends, telling them the information which Bell had given him as to who were the real incendiaries. One of these letters fell into the hands of Daluegas, the chief of the secret police. The letter cost Bell his life. On April 3rd, he was murdered in the village of Kufstein in Austria by Nazis who went there from Munich. The murder of Hanussen. The clairvoyant Erich Hanussen gave a housewarming party on the day before the Reichstag fire at his new flat in Berlin, Leitzenbergstrasse 16, which he called the Palace of Occultism. Some of the Nazi leaders were present on this occasion, including Count Helldorf, leader of the Berlin Nazis, as well as artists, actors, and journalists. Among them there was also a reporter of the Berliner 12 Uhr Blatt. In the séance which Hanussen staged, he said, among other things, "I see a great house burning." In the first March number of his weekly paper, Hanussen's Bunte Wochenschau, Hanussen printed an article on the political situation. He wrote in this article that he had known in advance of the Reichstag fire, but that he was not able to speak openly of it. It is clear that some leading Nazi must have given Hanussen information before the Reichstag fire, which enabled Hanussen to foresee it. Hanussen must have known a great deal. This is clear from a sworn deposition given us by Dr. Franz Hollering, former editor of the Berliner 12 Uhr Blatt. The undersigned Dr. Franz Hollering hereby declares on oath, in my capacity as editor-in-chief of the Berliner 12 Uhr Blatt and of the Montag Morgen, I was brought into touch between February 1st and March 4th, 1933, with Erich Hanussen as the publisher of his National Socialist Clairvoyant Journal, which was set up and printed in the same printing works as the papers named above. I did not get to know Hanussen personally, but I had a telephone conversation with him on one occasion when he was trying to get in touch with the business manager of the printing works and the editor, Roly Nürnberg, who were not there at the time. That was in the night of February 27th, the night of the burning of the Reichstag. The first report of the discovery of the fire had hardly reached the office when Hanussen rang up on the telephone. He wanted to know from me how far the fire had spread and whether the incendiaries had been caught. I replied that an unconfirmed report had reached me about a communist troop which was alleged to have set fire to the Reichstag with the help of torches. At the same time, I pointed out that this report was incredible. I said in so many words that the communists, particularly in the existing political situation, would never have committed such a suicidal act of folly. Hanussen replied in an excited voice that he was of quite the opposite opinion, that he knew it was a communist plot, and that I would very soon see the consequences. This call came through between 9:30 and 9:45. I made inquiries of my staff, which knew of Hanussen's close connections with Count Helldorf, particularly through his frequent telephone calls to the printing works. Hanussen was generally regarded as exceptionally well informed on National Socialist plans. Signed, Dr. Franz Hollering. Thus, at a time when the first vague reports of the fire in the Reichstag had only just reached the editorial offices of the newspapers, Hanussen was already saying that the fire had been started by the communists and that it would have serious consequences. This statement of Hanussen's shows more clearly than anything else that his informant is to be found in high Nazi circles. The Jew Hanussen did not long enjoy the rule of Hitler, which he had so earnestly desired. On April 7, 1933, his body was found in a little wood by the side of the Bayreuth-Neuhof road. He had died at the hands of the Nazis. The third man who knew the secret. After Bell, Hanussen. After Hanussen, Dr. Oberfohren. Of these three persons who knew the secret of the burning of the Reichstag, Dr. Oberfohren was the most dangerous. Bell could be got rid of as a political adventurer, Hanussen as a charlatan. Dr. Oberfohren was an influential politician, leader of the German nationalist fraction in the Reichstag. In February 1933, he had declared in an election speech that the Hitler government would continue to exist in its then composition, whatever the results of the election. Events after February 27th shook his belief that the National Socialists would stand by the undertaking sworn by Hitler on January 30th. Dr. Oberfohren put forward within the German Nationalist Party the proposal that it should begin the fight against Hitler's policy of concentrating power in his own hands. In order to win his friends for this fight, he recorded what he knew of the Reichstag fire and of the struggle within the cabinet in the memorandum which has already been quoted. The following description by Dr. Oberfohren deals with what happened after the Reichstag fire. The German nationalists and the fire. However much the German Nationalist Party is in agreement with the sharpest measures against the communists, it cannot approve of the act of incendiarism carried out by its coalition friends. It is true that the cabinet meeting on Tuesday agreed to the sharpest measures against the communists and partly also against the Social Democrats. However, no doubt was left that the act of incendiarism would most seriously damage the reputation of the National Front abroad. In this meeting of the cabinet, the sharpest expressions of condemnation were not spared. The National Socialist ministers did not succeed in pressing through the prohibition of the Communist Party. As already said above, the German nationalists needed the Communist deputies in order to prevent the National Socialists from having an absolute majority in parliament. At this cabinet meeting, Herr Göring was strictly forbidden to produce in public his forged material from Karl Liebknecht House. It was pointed out that the publication of these crude forgeries would only make things still worse for the government. It was particularly inconvenient for the government that the Communist deputy Torgler, leader of the Communist fraction in the Reichstag, had put himself at the disposal of the police on Tuesday morning. His flight would have been preferable. The fact that after thousands of Communist functionaries had been arrested, and in spite of the threat of a court-martial, he had presented himself to the police, was extremely inconvenient for the government. Herr Göring was commissioned to deny that Torgler had given himself up voluntarily. The echo in the world press, however, which followed the Reichstag fire, was so unexpectedly unanimous in attributing the act of incendiarism to leading members of the government that the prestige of the national government was most seriously shaken. However convenient it was for Göring and Goebbels that the Communist and Social Democratic election propaganda had been silenced, however well they knew that the broad mass of lower middle-class persons, clerks and peasants, would believe the story of the Reichstag fire and would consequently give their votes to the National Socialist Party as the leader of the fight against Bolshevism, they were seriously disturbed at the attitude of the German nationalist ministers in the cabinet. Once again, they did not get the prohibition of the Communist Party. In spite of their boundless pretensions, they felt that they were held in an iron embrace by the German nationalists, Stahlhelm and the Reichswehr. It was clear to them that they must get out of this embrace as soon as possible. They discussed all kinds of proposals. Finally, the groups decided to make a bid for power by a coup in the night of March 5th to 6th. The plan was to occupy the government quarter and demand from Hindenburg a change in the composition of the cabinet. In this event, Hindenburg was to appoint Adolf Hitler to take over the functions of President of the Reich, and at the same time Hitler was to appoint Göring chancellor. The discussions led up to the decision to carry through the plan in connection with the great propaganda march of Nazi stormtroops and protective corps through Berlin, at which Hitler would take the salute on Friday, March 3rd. This great propaganda march was then organized. Numbers of provincial stormtroop sections arrived in Berlin, the streets were cleared by the police for the triumphal march, traffic was diverted, and thousands of people crowded to the Wilhelmstrasse to see the march past the leader Adolf Hitler. As rumors had been gaining ground that the government quarter was to be occupied in the course of this march, at the last moment the German nationalist ministers in the cabinet insisted that Adolf Hitler should abandon the march past in the Wilhelmstrasse. The thousands waiting at the Wilhelmstrasse were suddenly told, to their astonishment, that the Nazi march would follow another route, and would not touch the Wilhelmstrasse, but would go through Prince Albertstrasse into the west of the town. However, the German nationalists were obliged to agree for their part to abandon a Stahlhelm march through the government quarter, which had been announced for the day of the elections as an act of homage to Hindenburg. The Stahlhelm leaders agreed to the change. The position was extremely serious for the German nationalist ministers. The election results in Lippe-Detmold had shown how great the danger was, that German national electors would pass over the National Socialists in a body. German nationalist propaganda could not compete with the unrestrained propaganda carried on by the National Socialists. The Herren Club, the groups connected with the Stahlhelm, and the German nationalist leaders discussed the position. After the occupation of the government quarter on March 3rd had been averted, it was necessary to prepare for the threatened coup on the night of March 5th through 6th, with more than the Reichswehr and the Stahlhelm. It was clear that the masses were now no longer behind the old field marshal, but behind their idol, Adolf Hitler. It would be futile to oppose these masses and the sentiment of the masses merely by the use of arms. It was therefore necessary to act as unscrupulously as Göring and Goebbels had done in connection with the Reichstag fire. The following plan was made. An official statement was to be made public dealing with the results so far arrived at in the inquiry in connection with the Reichstag incendiaries. This statement was so worded that if necessary it would be possible to refer to it to show that they were already then on the tracks of the National Socialist criminals. This official statement could then be used for the press on the night of March 5th through 6th as weapon against the National Socialist ministers, if these really attempted to carry out their plan of occupying the government quarter. It was hoped by these means to throw the National Socialist masses into confusion and, if possible, to win them for the National Front under the leadership of the German nationalists and for Hindenburg, to disclose the plans for the forcible seizure of power, to accuse Goering, Hitler, and Goebbels of the act of incendiarism in the Reichstag, on the basis of the official communiqué already issued, and to call on the millions of National Socialists to stand united behind Field Marshal Hindenburg to save the National Front against Marxism. It was hoped by these means to make the national masses prepared to accept a military dictatorship under Hindenburg. Hindenburg himself was not to be present at the Stahlhelm demonstration, but was to spend the night of March 5th to the 6th outside of Berlin under the protection of the Reichswehr, and the Reichswehr itself was to be mobilized for action. Murderer and incendiary. Dr. Oberfohren wrote in his memorandum, "In the meantime, the men charged by Herr Goering under the leadership of Heines, Silesian storm troop leader and Reichstag deputy, passed along the heating passages from the palace of the President of the Reichstag and through the underground passage into the Reichstag. The point at which each of the selected storm troop and protective corps leader was to start a fire was arranged in detail. A general rehearsal had been held the previous day. Van der Lubbe went with them as the fifth or sixth man. When the observation posts in the Reichstag sent word that the air was clear, the incendiary set to work. The starting of the fire was completed within a few minutes. Then, their work accomplished, they made their way back by the same route as they had come. Van der Lubbe alone remained behind in the Reichstag building." Dr. Oberfohren's statement that Heines was in charge of the incendiary column is confirmed from other sources, including Dr. Bell. Heines was especially suitable for this work. He murders when he is told to, he shoots when he is told to, and he sets fire when he is told to. The incendiary's base. Even if Goering's tools had prepared the act of provocation more carefully, and had not made the whole series of contradictions which in themselves are overwhelming evidence of the Nazis' guilt, the case against the Nazis would still be clear to all eyes to see. The Vossische Zeitung of March 1st, 1933, contains the following statement emanating from government sources. It is stated that there is irrefutable evidence that Deputy Torgler, chairman of the Communist faction of the Reichstag, was in the Reichstag building for several hours with the incendiary, and that he had also been in company with other persons who participated in the incendiary act. It is added that the other criminals may have been able to escape through the underground passage used in connection with the heating equipment of the Reichstag, which connects the Reichstag building itself with the building of the President of the Reichstag. As we have already said, there is in fact an underground passage leading from the Reichstag building to the house of the President of the Reichstag. At the time of the Reichstag fire, the occupant of this house, to which the underground passage leads, was Hermann Goering. He occupies the house through which, according to his own version, the criminals escaped. Hermann Goering is not only Prime Minister of Prussia, Minister of Police, and President of the Reichstag. Hermann Goering is also one of the chiefs of the storm troop organization. Hermann Goering has at his disposal a special storm detachment, Storm Detachment G. His house is constantly guarded by a staff guard consisting of at least 30 men. The official Preußische Pressedienst announced that at least 7 men must have been concerned in bringing the incendiary material into the Reichstag, and the actual operation of starting the fire must have taken 10 men. If we accept this statement, at least 10 men must have been concerned in the fire. It can be safely assumed that the fire was started at a number of different points in different parts of the building. Otherwise, it would be impossible to explain the rapidity with which the fire spread in the huge building. To start the fire at several points required a considerable quantity of inflammable material weighing several hundredweight. In his report to fire brigade inspectors and men, Director Gempp stated that after the fire he observed a considerable quantity of incendiary material which had not been used, and that a lorry would have been required to carry it. The statement by Director Gempp confirms the assumption that the incendiaries must have taken a large quantity of incendiary material into the Reichstag. How was the incendiary material taken into the Reichstag? We have given a description of the obstacles a visitor has to overcome in order to get into the Reichstag. Visitors are only admitted through door 5. They have to pass through a series of officials. Can it be imagined that between 7 and 10 men carrying several hundredweight of incendiary material can have slipped into the Reichstag without being noticed by a single one of the Reichstag officials? Even the most prejudiced observer must admit that no incendiary and no group of incendiaries could have dared to bring in the material through door 5. The case is just the same with the so-called deputies' entrance, door 2. Only deputies are allowed to enter by this door. The idea that deputies could have brought hundredweights of incendiary material past the officials at door 2 is no less absurd than the idea that the material could have been brought in by door 5. The incendiaries would therefore have been obliged to choose some other way, a secret way, which would allow them to bring the material into the Reichstag and distribute it at the points required. There is such a secret way into the Reichstag, namely the underground passage, which connects the house of the President of the Reichstag with the Reichstag building itself. This underground passage was the strategic route for the incendiaries. But anyone who wants to use the underground passage to the Reichstag was obliged first to pass through Göring's house, the house of the President of the Reichstag. He was therefore obliged to get past the guards, who were constantly watching Göring's house. He would also had to have run the risk of being seen by someone in Göring's house. Is it conceivable that communists could have got into Göring's house and through it and through the underground passage without being stopped and arrested by the guard of 30 men? Is it conceivable that communists could have taken hundredweights of incendiary material through Göring's house without having been stopped and arrested by the guard? Is it conceivable that communists could have escaped through Göring's house? It is out of the question. Any communist who in those days of February had tried to enter Göring's house would without a doubt have been arrested. It was impossible for communists to reach the Reichstag by way of Göring's house and the underground passage. But for whom, then, was it possible? Only leading National Socialists could have entered Göring's house without attracting attention and without arousing even the slightest suspicion. Many meetings took place in the house between Göring and the leading officials of the National Socialist Party. No storm-troop man would have thought of stopping men who held high positions in his party and whom he often saw visiting Göring's house. There was no danger for such people. They could go in and out as they liked. This is true of all the higher officials. They could have brought the incendiary material required in small quantities without any difficulty and without attracting any attention. The guards would not have noticed anything if a number of chests described as documents or even as arms had been delivered to the basement of the house. The transport of arms was taking place in those days wherever there was a Nazi headquarters. Göring's house was the key position for the attack on the Reichstag. Whoever controlled Göring's house could do what he liked to the Reichstag building. Goering's house was the bridgehead from which the incendiary column advanced to the assault. Goering's house was the depot where the incendiary material was stored. Goering's house was the safe port into which the criminals could flee when they had perpetrated their crime. The incendiary column. We said above that only leading National Socialists could have entered Goering's house without arousing suspicion. Dr. Oberfohren also speaks of selected leaders of the storm troops and protective corps. It is clear that the National Socialist leadership, which devised and organized the plan of the Reichstag fire, were very much interested in seeing that the carrying out of the plan was entrusted to their most reliable praetorians. Goebbels and Goering could not put themselves into the hands of any storm troop members. They could not run the risk that some discontented storm troop men might expose the real incendiaries. Therefore, they had to seek their accomplices in the ranks of the highest officials of the party. Men had to be found who, on the one hand, would not shrink from any crime, and on the other, were so closely linked to the National Socialist leadership and with their fate that they could not be suspected of any treachery. And the ranks of the leaders of the National Socialist Party leadership are full of persons who satisfy these conditions. We know from Dr. Oberfohren's memorandum that the murderer Heines was put in charge of the incendiary column. How was the incendiary act carried out? The incendiary column assembled in Goering's house. Heines, Schultz, Helldorf, and the others could get past the guards without interference, as they were known as storm troop leaders. Van der Lubbe probably went in with Count Helldorf. The first task which had to be carried out was the transport of the incendiary material, for which purpose the incendiaries used the underground passage to the Reichstag from Goering's house. It is probable that several journeys had to be made. They began their operations at an agreed signal which told them that the last deputy had left the Reichstag. There was no danger of discovery by the Reichstag officials on duty, for these had been sent home by the Nazi inspector before the end of their spell of duty. The distribution of the incendiary material at the various points, and pouring petrol, benzene, etc. over it, must have taken some little time, at least 20 minutes. Then the fire was started at different points. The first reports issued by the police and the fire brigade spoke of 7 to 10 incendiaries and of the fire having started at many points. No one in Germany believed that the incendiaries had got into the Reichstag in the usual way and had left by the usual way. The question was raised, how did the incendiaries escape? Any careless talk by a policeman, any careless talk from the fire brigade, any newspaper report might create an alarming position. Goering was in an extremely difficult situation. He resorted to an old trick. Before anyone else suggested that the incendiaries must have escaped through the underground passage, Goering wanted to say it himself. He hoped thereby to meet the imminent danger, to present something that was highly suspicious as quite harmless. Goering himself stated that the incendiaries had escaped through the underground passage. But later he bitterly regretted that he had said this. The trick had not come off. And so this underground passage to Goering's house was never again mentioned in any minister's speech or in any official report. Goering's statement was to be forgotten. We have not forgotten it. It is a fact that the incendiaries escaped through the underground passage, but they could only use this passage because they knew it led to Goering's house. Goering's house meant safety. The official Preußische Pressedienst of February 28th stated that the incendiaries had full knowledge of the building. Who other than Goering's friends were in the best position to gain full knowledge, to examine and test the underground passage? Goering was master in the Reichstag. He could give his friends information about every corner of it. He was master in the palace of the president of the Reichstag. He could receive his friends there. He could arrange a store and hiding place for the incendiary material. He was Prussian Minister of the Interior. He controlled the police throughout Prussia. All the possibilities of organizing the burning of the Reichstag were in the hands of Goering. Van der Lubbe in the burning Reichstag. The Preußische Pressedienst tried to persuade the public that van der Lubbe had been unable to escape because he did not know the building. According to Goering and the Preußische Pressedienst, all of van der Lubbe's accomplices were quite familiar with the building. It would have been easy for them to take van der Lubbe with them and to save him. But van der Lubbe could not be saved. He had to be left behind in the burning Reichstag, and was left behind because he was the evidence against the communists. Van der Lubbe played his part to the best of his ability. He let himself be arrested in the burning building. He had discarded his shirt and coat so as to present a true picture of a communist incendiary. He confessed to having set fire to the Reichstag. He confessed to any act of incendiarism required in the welfare office in Neukölln, in the Berlin town hall, in the Berliner Schloss. Van der Lubbe will confess to everything which his employers ask him to confess. He will say against Torgler whatever his employers tell him to say. He will say against Dimitrov everything that is wanted. He will inculpate everyone whom his National Socialist friends wish to destroy. He will exculpate everyone whom his National Socialist friends wished to protect. Hermann Goering. But all of van der Lubbe's confessions could not prevent the failure of the second task, which had been entrusted to him, by giving himself up and confessing to shelter the real incendiaries. The figure of van der Lubbe was too small for this. His role was too obvious. Everyone saw through the trick. They realized that behind van der Lubbe was Captain Hermann Goering, one of the storm troop chiefs, minister of the German Reich, premier and minister of the Interior of Prussia, president of the German Reichstag. Captain Goering was born in Rosenheim, Bavaria on January 12, 1893. His biographers tell us of his heroic deeds as an airman during the war. They forgot to add that his flights were carried out when he was under the influence of morphia. Goering's biographers tell us that in 1925 through 26 he was in Stockholm working for an airplane company. They forgot to add that Hermann Goering, according to the official reports of the Stockholm police, was put into the asylum at Langbro because a doctor had certified him to be of unsound mind. He was subsequently taken to the Konradsberg hospital near Stockholm, but as a result of his conduct he was taken back to Langbro and there kept shut up. He could no longer be kept in private mental homes because the staff were unwilling to look after him. And in Langbro he had such bad attacks that he had to be put into the section for serious cases. All the attempts made by Goering to deny these facts are vain, as we have a photograph of the official registration card recording Goering's admission to the Langbro asylum. Goering's biographers like to record his marriage with Karin von Fock. She had previously been married to a Swede, Captain Kansow. After the divorce, the former couple had a lawsuit over the guardianship of their son Thomas. During the court proceedings on April 22, 1926, a certificate signed by the police doctor Karl A. Lundberg was submitted, We print a photograph of this certificate, which says in so many words that Goering is seriously addicted to drugs. Goering's morphia craving has therefore been established before the courts. The court decided that Goering could not have the guardianship of the boy Thomas. National Socialism has given Goering the guardianship of 60 million Germans. On March 10, 1933, Goering made a speech in Essen, in the course of which he said, quote, "My nerves have never given way up to now." Unquote. He hoped by this remark to silence the statements published in the foreign press regarding his nervous condition. At that time, he did not realize that there was in existence documentary proof of his nervous condition, his insanity, his craving for morphia. It is no accident that this man is playing a leading part in the Third Empire. He embodies the whole brutality of the old Prussian officers' corps, which has been striving for power ever since 1918. He is the embodiment of the sadism which in the last few months has led to thousands of murders and tens of thousands of brutal and cruel acts of maltreatment. He is the embodiment of that officers' clique which murdered Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, which shed streams of blood in Hungary, which set up white gallows in Finland, and is now making the whole of Hitler's Germany into a brown hell. Goering represents the content of the policy of the National Socialists. National Socialism does not represent the workers, or the employees, or the middle class, but it represents the interests of the ruling class, of the noble caste. Power was put into the hands of the National Socialists in order that they should maintain the existing economic system and protect it against the menacing forces of social revolution. To protect these interests, National Socialism has taken its highest officials from the ranks of the former officers' corps of the nobility and the high state officials. This Captain Goering, brutal in the extreme, lying and cowardly in the extreme, shows the true face of National Socialism. This Captain Goering was the organizer of the Reichstag fire. His party comrade Goebbels invented the plan. Goering carried it through. All the opportunities for doing so were in his hands. All the necessary power was in his hands. He held all the threads. It was the morphia fiend Goering who set fire to the Reichstag. End of chapter 4.